Well, welcome everyone. Hi, I'm Regina Celestin Williams. I am the new executive director of SB at Home, and I'm just so happy to be here with you all today at our November Housing Action Coalition meeting. And I really just wanted to welcome you in the spirit of this season of Thanksgiving. I wanted to talk about how grateful I am to be with you all, working alongside of you all to do this tremendous work of increasing the availability of affordable homes for those who are most vulnerable in our Silicon Valley. So what better way to talk about how we can work to push this forward than by getting a wonderful update on the legislative and budget items that have been happening at the state level. And with that, I will turn it over to the team to jump right into this wonderful discussion. Thank you all, and let's keep doing this great work together.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Regina. So I'm Allison Singalani. I am the Policy and Research Associate for SB at Home. I want to welcome you all today to HAC. HAC stands for Housing Action Coalition. So this is a monthly discussion-based and action-focused event hosted by SB at Home. We typically have on the fourth Friday of every month. We want to have this meeting style by design. So normally we'd all be in a room together. We can't do that right now, but we do ask that try as much as you can to capture the feeling of meeting and interacting in person by keeping your camera on. In that spirit, we also encourage you to ask lots of questions. We want to have that community dialogue feel. So just a few ground rules before we get started. We want to ensure that conversations and relationships here today remain respectful and productive. Please be kind and courteous to each other. We won't tolerate rude comments or personal attacks. We do encourage asking questions and listening. Both are active components of learning and engaging with each other. Please remember today's conversation is focused on the California legislative activity and budget, and keep comments and questions on topic. We do find that sometimes the chat can get lively. So if you find that it's distracting you from the content of the discussion, we encourage you to consider closing the chat temporarily. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Corey to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you very much, Allison. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Before I introduce Graciella, I'll just share something about our organization that some of you might not know. Obviously, you all know about Silicon Valley at Home. Some of you might not realize that SV at Home also has an affiliated organization called the SV at Home Action Fund, which is more focused on taking direct action through lobbying and trying to persuade elected officials, especially at the state level, to create the budgetary and policy framework that makes housing affordability more possible at the local level, and also by engaging in things at the local level to educate voters, make sure people register to vote, and things like that. So it's in that capacity in our capacity as the SV at Home Action Fund that we have Graciella Castillo-Krings as our lobbyist in Sacramento. Graciella Castillo-Krings is part of the team at Sacramento Advocates. She's spent over 16 years in and around California government. Prior to becoming a lobbyist, she spent 5 years as the Deputy Legislative Affairs Secretary to Governor Jerry Brown. Graciella now represents SV at Home Action Fund in Sacramento, and she's going to give us a bit of a presentation talking about some of the things that we've seen over the last year when it comes to housing in the state capitol, and maybe some previews of what is in store in the year ahead. Graciella? Oh, Graciella, I think you might still be muted.
I apologize. It's 2 years in Zoom and I apparently have not figured it out yet. Hi, everyone. Graciella Castillo-Krings. Thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to present to this group and exciting to have other people that support housing. So with that, let's get started. It's been a very interesting legislative year. We thought that 2021 was going to be different than 2020, but unfortunately, that was not the case. Next slide, please. So one of the things, just to give you a quick overview of where we are. So on September 10th, the legislature did adjourn, and it was the first year of the 2-year session. It started off with a lot of energy. There were thousands of bills that were introduced, and we really thought that it was going to be back to normal. Unfortunately, the pandemic continues to impact the way that the legislature conducts business, and it also impacts the conversations we're able to have. Right now, a lot of the hearings continue to be, basically everything needs to still be online, very limited access to staff. You know, people have to the number of people allowed in the Capitol is still being reduced. And all of these disruptions really make it difficult for us to have very nuanced policy conversations. And at the end of the day, the legislature decided to reduce the number of bills that each member gets to move forward. Normally in the Assembly, they have about 50 bills. In the Senate, they have 40 bills. And we decided that it was going to be important for everybody to reduce the number of legislation that they were carrying to only 12. So by the end of the year, only about 800 bills made it to the governor's desk. That's including budget measures. Next slide. And at the end, the other issue that happened is COVID obviously did not just impact legislation, it also impacted budget and conversations around budget, because as you may remember, a lot of us were able to file our taxes after the traditional April 15 deadline. The way that budget normally functions is by everybody files April 15th, then those numbers inform what we call the May revise, when budget starts getting finalized and the legislature is able to meet their constitutional deadline. They have to pass a complete budget by June 15th, so that gives the governor enough time to sign, and we can start a new budget, the fiscal year, which is July 1st. So what happened this year, because a lot of the tax filings were delayed, we did not have those numbers. The legislature had to basically pass a placeholder budget to meet the constitutional deadline and make sure that the state had funding. And then really a lot of the bulk of the negotiations happened over the July, August months, and they were able to actually have real policy conversations during those months, but they actually reached an actual budget by June 28th. And one of the things that was very surprising to everybody is, despite the pandemic, California coffers have actually been doing really well, right? We have had an unprecedented an unprecedented surplus, and additional federal aid really bolstered kind of the amount of funding that the legislature had. So we had about $262.6 billion. That's right, with a B. So just something for us to consider and think about. One of the things that I also wanted to highlight, next slide, please, are some of the expenditures. So overall, the budget had about close to $18 billion dedicated specifically for homelessness and housing production. So I'm just highlighting some of the expenditures on this slide. As you can see, 1.4, a little over. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having some trouble with the audio. Sorry about that. As I was saying, over $18 billion were specifically allocated to housing. For homelessness, I'm just highlighting some of the major expenditures, and I'm not going to go over them. You can see them here. And then let me show you some of the other expenditures that actually were that went into housing production. Next slide, please. So as you can see, one of the things, 1.75 billion, this is a large number. And what the governor and the legislature were hoping to achieve with this funding was to ensure that some of the shovel-ready projects that normally rely on tax credits and other sources of state funding had additional money. The 1.75 is for projects that are eligible and are ready to go. They don't need to wait for tax credit. We're trying to get the project's money so that we can start actually building them. And as you can see, a couple of other just expenditures that I wanted to highlight. One of the other things that is not on this list is that the governor decided to actually create a housing accountability unit. He dedicated about 4.3 million this year to ensure that HCD was going to have a specific unit just to ensure that local jurisdictions were complying with all of the different state laws that have been passing over the last couple of years. So that's really exciting, because up until recently, HCD really lacked the resources and lack the people to start enforcing against the number of cities and counties that we have. So really exciting for us to see, and everyone's watching to make sure that those dollars lead to actual enforcement. And hopefully, maybe sometimes it's not going to be enforcement. Sometimes it will be for cities to have help and additional resources that sometimes they currently don't have. So, and I'm going to quickly look at the chat, see if there's any questions. Oh, perfect. We have one. It says, what is the likelihood that Home Key continues being funded into the next year? Well, you're getting ahead of me, but here goes. So recent projections are coming out that we're actually going to have an additional surplus this year. Right now, the estimate is about an additional 31 billion. So that means there might be likelihood that Home Key continues to get funded. The question, though, is how long are we going to have that funding for? And that is going to be the true question, because what happens 5 years from now, if the state is not doing as well, we might actually see reductions in this funding, but that's a conversation that we can continue to have. For right now, it looks like we are going to be able to continue this type of funding. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So one of the things, as Corey was saying, SB at Home Action Fund has been engaging in Sacramento a lot more robustly than it has in the past. And one of the key things that what guides which policies we actually engage in which policies we actively advocate for, is we are guided by what we call the 3Ps framework. Some of you might have heard about it already, but really it's protection, preservation, and production. And we are really excited because over the last couple of years that I have been in Sacramento working with SB at Home Action Fund, there have been some really good pieces of legislation that have passed. In fact, one of them, SB at Home, was instrumental in part of the coalition that helped pass the statewide rent cap. That's a couple of years ago. Many of you may remember that. And they also were integral in making sure that the creation of the Bay Area Housing Financing Authority, which is the first regional housing finance authority in the state. And now actually that piece of legislation is being modeled in LA. So some really good things here that are happening that are originating in Northern California. Next slide, please. So a couple of things just highlight, it feels like it was such a long time ago, but the eviction moratorium. This was something that was really important for us to make sure that it not only passed in 2020, but that it got extended. So as many of you remember, when COVID happened, a lot of people lost their jobs and the opportunity to actually pay their bills, pay their rent. And so the state ended up creating a quick moratorium to kind of stabilize things. We were not sure how long the pandemic was going to last. It became pretty clear that it was going to last much longer than any of us anticipated. So fast forward, the legislature has actually been working on different extensions. The latest one that was passed, as you can see here, was SB 91, which not only extended the moratorium until June 30th of 2021, but it also provided additional funding. Now, we all know that that was not sufficient. And so there was another piece of legislation that passed that extended the moratorium until September 30th of 2021. And so a lot of different things, it feels, again, some of these conversations happened a long time ago and they were still in 2021. A couple of bills that I just want to quickly highlight for you are under the 3Ps framework. We were looking at supporting AB 1174, which was really reducing or making sure that impact fees, that they were reasonable and the local governments were able to justify, and there was a nexus study. We had other pieces of legislation, many of which you've already heard about, so I'm not going to go too deep into the details, but SB 8, SB 9, which really allowed ministerial approval of subdivisions and duplex, and you cannot build more than 4 units on a single family home if you use both of the privileges under that piece of legislation. SB 10, which allows local governments to use this piece of legislation if they choose to upzone a parcel up to 10 units. And then obviously the other big theme in the legislature right now is accountability and enforcement. So AB 215 by Assemblymember Chu creates clear guidance and who can actually enforce all of the different pieces of legislation, like SB 35, which allows construction to come online more quickly, ministerial approval. This legislation made it clear that HCD can actually have authority when cities are not complying with that law. It also gave additional authority and clarity in authority to the Attorney General to be able to sue cities when they're not complying. And they don't need, under this law, they don't need to have HCD say, hey, can you sue Long Beach or can you sue another city? They can do it on their own. So one of the big things that we're seeing is additional enforcement. There is money in the budget to help cities go into compliance with some of their housing goals, but at the same time, we want to make sure that everybody is doing the right thing, that they're following the law, and that includes local jurisdictions. Next slide, please. And before I give you a preview of 2022, I want to just double check and make sure we don't have any other questions. Great. So 2022 is around the corner, and we are hoping that this year is going to continue to have good progressive pieces of legislation move forward, and that we're going to continue to have sustained budget commitments from the state to continue to promote production of both affordable and market rate. So one of the, next slide, please. One of the things I want to highlight, so 2022, it's an election year. And what that means is the governor and all statewide offices are up for re-election. I know we just went through a recall, but the governor is up for re-election now. And the other big thing for me to flag for you is that every assembly seat will be up for, and only half of the Senate seats. Now, one of the things for you to keep in mind is for 2024, that is going to be a big year for elections. We are actually going to be seeing a total of, we're going to have a number of incumbents that are not going to be able to run again because they will be termed out. They can no longer run. And we're talking about 1/3 of the actual assembly. And so that is going to be, we're going to lose a lot of our champions. Some of the people that we have worked very closely with, for example, Speaker Atkins, Assembly Member Gonzalez, and Senator Portantino, Senator Skinner, who have been our champions both on housing and are also guiding our budget process, Assemblymember Ting. So we're going to be losing the speaker as well. We have a lot of expertise that suddenly we are not going to have in 2024. So that's something for us to kind of keep in mind. Next slide, please. So a couple of things. There's an uncertainty right now. As many of you know, Assemblymember Chu is no longer in the assembly. And so that actually left a vacancy, not just for his seat, but also the chair of Assembly Housing. So we don't know who that's going to be. And hopefully the speaker should be deciding soon, because come January, that is one of the first policy deadlines is the House of Origin. So all of the bills that were 2-year bills that are in the House that was introduced them have to switch over to the next House. So the other thing that I was just mentioning is we're going to have another budget surplus. Again, right now it's estimated that we might have an additional $31 billion. And that's not even taking into account additional federal funding that might also be coming down the pike if the Biden administration is able to get some of the pieces of legislation they're currently negotiating. And when we are looking about what policy priorities, again, it's an election year, and that might change kind of the politics of the equation, but housing and homelessness will continue to be a big priority. We have only started to scratch the surface in fixing that problem. So you better be sure that there's going to be additional legislation and conversation around this. The other big thing that we are seeing is climate change related policy. And I'm talking about drought, wildfire, all of these other conversations that could actually impact housing conversations. Because at the end of the day, we truly believe that when it comes to housing policy, it is climate change policy. Where people are located, if they have to drive long distances, that does impact then our vehicle miles traveled, air pollution, and quality of life. So those are some of the issues we're definitely going to be seeing. And the other big unknown is COVID-19. We thought again that 2021, that we were going to have a back to normal year, and that is not the case. We're not sure how, if there's a bigger surge, how that impacts both our economy or just the access to schools and what that might mean. One of the other things, as many of you might know and have been experiencing, is the disruption in the supply chain. We have, for example, backups in a port when you look at ports, when you look at LA and Long Beach. And so all of these other factors will impact the conversations in Sacramento. And Next slide. Great. So that's all I have for you now. One of the things that I did want to mention, I wanted to say thank you to all of you, because we would not have been able to be successful in getting SB 9 and SB 10 and other victories that we had we not had people helping us on the ground, calling your assembly member, calling your senator, saying these are important policies that have to move forward. Also, we had some great champions, and we continue to develop good leadership in the assembly. We have Assemblymember Berman, Assemblymember Grayson, Senator Weiner, Senator Skinner, big housing champions and advocates that, despite not only taking hard votes, but also really moving the conversation forward. So just thank you. When you see your elected, whether it be assembly member, senator, please let them know that you're watching. That's really important for them. They always care to hear about their constituents. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions.
So if anyone has any more questions, please do put them in the chat. I have a bunch of burning questions, so I'll kick us off while we're waiting for more questions to pop up in the chat, but please do add yours there. So kind of a big question, picking up on what you just said. Almost all of SB at Home's priority legislation was passed by the Assembly and the Senate and signed into law this year. And that's great news. We want to brag a little bit, but I was hoping you might tell us a little bit about how you think that happened, and building on the momentum we had from the last couple of years, especially with some of the tenant protection bills that have passed in the last couple of years, and then the preservation bills, and this year some of those production bills. So we're really getting those 3 Ps all pursued in Sacramento. What do you think has changed over the last few years, and including in the last year, to make that possible?
Well, it was not easy, Corey. I mean, part of the thing is, if you think about, for example, SB 9, it's a couple of years in the making. And the reality, it actually has gotten much more difficult to get some of the progressive housing bills passed, simply because if you think about 2017, for example, when SB 35 was first passed by the legislature and signed by Governor Brown, at the time, people were like, oh, wait, I know there's a housing shortage. And I know a lot of people that are on this call today know that. But the mainstream public was not as aware of it. Now we have seen additional, especially with the eviction moratorium that happened, especially because rents were getting higher. You see more people. It's hard to walk outside and not see homelessness. And I think people are starting to resonate. Some of the crisis is resonating in a very different way than it was 6 years ago. At the same time, one of the big things that you have seen in Sacramento is really this idea of state versus local control. Up until recently, and by recently, I'm talking about the last 7 years, the reality is Sacramento allowed a lot of the local jurisdictions to make the decision as to where and how housing was going to be produced. We've come to realize that might not have been the best approach, and we're trying to figure out what the right balance is between state intervention and allowing the locals. And so as the state has become much more engaged, you are getting a lot of pushback, not just from local cities and counties, but also from residents saying, wait a minute, I don't want the state to tell me what to do. I don't want my neighbors to suddenly have 4 units or a duplex. And so people have become a lot more activated and engaged. And what has been really helpful is organizations like SB at Home who are engaged. It was fantastic. And Corey, you and I have worked on this. I would call you and say, hey, we're having an issue with this assembly person. Do you know if we have activists and people that are engaged that we can call on? And especially during COVID, that became so critical. And so suddenly, people were kind of helping us out by running, if they ran into their senators at Costco or at a Safeway, whatever, they say, hey, where are you on SB 9? Where are you on SB 10? And suddenly it's just different coming from an actual constituent than just a lobbyist. So a lot of the things, I think social media engagement has really kind of helped. Again, picking up the phone and calling. And so as we are getting additional people that are saying, don't vote for this, countering that has been really helpful.
That's a really good point. And of course, the legislature is, 40 senators, 80 assembly members, the governor, they're all unique individuals, right? With different decision-making processes, different priorities, very different constituencies. Is there anything, without picking or highlighting one or two too much, but in general, looking at that diverse range of people and constituencies from different parts of the state, is there anything you can share about how different approaches work with different legislators, or how different parts of the state have a difference in their housing conversation and priorities?
Yes, and the reality is California is not monolithic. You look at the different communities and geographies. In fact, I was talking to Assemblymember Lackey, and he represents kind of some of the desert areas down in Southern California. And when I asked him, what are some of the challenges that you're facing? He basically said access to water. And so that is something a little different. Or when we were talking to Senator Durazo, basically her district has the largest percentage of renters. And so every person who represents, every senator, every assembly member, they have different constituencies and they have different problems that their districts face. For example, Assemblymember Rivas, he has been a big champion on when it comes to farm worker housing, because he has a lot of people that are farm workers that don't have access to affordable housing, right? And so everybody brings the voice of the constituency that they represent. And a lot of them, it's a little different. If you look at LA and how it's spread out, LA has a very different public transportation infrastructure than, say, San Francisco. San Francisco's landlocked, right? You have water around you. And so the geography of some of these areas do impact how the development has happened. And now when we're looking at how those planning decisions were done decades ago, right, trying to kind of figure out how to change them is going to take a little longer time. So one of the things that I would also ask everybody is just to keep that in mind and consider how different these parts of the states are. And just to kind of, one of the things that I think has been really helpful to me has been when I sit down with some of the elected officials, really trying to understand from their perspective the uniqueness of their district.
Thank you for that. I'll just say, I think everybody's being a bit shy today. I know we have a lot of people on this call, and there's a lot of material. There's a lot to talk about here. There's sometimes a lot of jargon when it comes to the housing discourse. So I'm sure people have questions. Please don't be shy. Please do put them in the chat if you can. We do want to hear from you. We do want to hear some of your questions. So please do type those into the chat if you can. While we're going to see if any more questions pop in. Actually, there was one, I do see one that was mentioned. Is there anything to say about redistricting, where we are in the redistricting process? You mentioned that it's an important election year in 2022, and even bigger election year in 2024, because so many people will be turned out. How does redistricting affect legislative discussions and kind of the mindset of people in Sacramento right now?
Yes, well, there's definitely, everyone's waiting to see the maps. Some of the drafts of the maps are out, and there's comments that are being made, and the final maps are going to happen later, I believe, later this year, and everyone's waiting to see how those maps end up impacting whether they can actually run in the districts that they represent now. Just to give you an example, Sacramento, for the city of Sacramento is going to be split into two, right? And so those type of discussions definitely impact where people end up and the type of conversations that will happen. So we will definitely hear more of that in Sacramento.
Yeah, it should be interesting, especially as those maps are finalized.
Yeah.
There was a couple of terms that you used, and I wanted to make sure people are familiar with them, or you can maybe help educate people. This is a chance for us all to learn. You mentioned a nexus study, and I don't know if everybody knows what a nexus study is. You mentioned it in the context of talking about impact fees. And of course, if something's causing impact, it should pay for it. That's the general perception. Why are impact fees important? And why is it also important not to maybe overplay our hand when it comes to impact fees? And what are those? And what does the nexus study have to do with that?
Thank you so much, Corey. So yes, actually in that piece of legislation, the other thing I will mention, so AB 602, Grayson, is actually asking local governments that when they're going to assess an impact fee is to pay for the impact a development might have, right? There might be additional fees for like sewer lines and water lines that need to be updated. And so that is the idea, that an impact fee is supposed to actually pay for the impact that the development is going to have. Now, what has happened though, there hasn't been a standardized formula for how cities assess an impact fee. So different cities have different fees, and sometimes some are better than others at being really transparent as to what the fees cover. So what has happened is sometimes developers have been questioning when they get really high impact fees, where the fees are going, where are they going? And so the other concern is when you have really high impact fees, that might make a project unfeasible. Suddenly, if you don't have the money to pay for the fees, you're not going to be able to actually finish construction, get the permits that you need, and so forth. So what this bill is going to do is saying, right now, there's another thing I want to throw out there. So there's a difference between taxes and fees. Taxes, basically, you can go ahead, they require 2/3 vote. You can use, you have more discretion as to how you use the money. A fee, the difference between a tax and a fee is that a fee has to have a direct benefit to whoever's paying it. Otherwise, it's a tax. And so what this is doing is making very clear that if you are actually paying a fee, that you can explain where the money is going and how that benefits the development. So that's one of the things. The other thing that I'm really excited about this particular bill and the change that it's going to do is it is actually going to say to cities beginning July 1 of 2022, the fee has to be calculated based on the square footage. And the reason that matters is it's also going to be what we call affordability by design, right? If you have a 3,000 square foot home and you have 1,000 square foot home, right now, both of them pay the same amount in impact fees. What this is saying is like, that doesn't make sense because 1,000 square foot home will have less of an impact than a 3,000 square foot home. So why don't we actually kind of balance things out a little bit? And the idea again is if you reduce the fees, you're able to pass it on to the renter, you're able to pass it on to the homeowner.
That's a really good point. And I'll add on that last point, when you talk about affordability by design, of course, when a developer is deciding what to build and how many units to build, if they say, well, let's say I've got 3,000 square feet to build on or to build in, I could build one big expensive unit and pay the same, and pay a fee, or I can build 3 units, but pay 3 times the fee. Well, you're going to build the one big expensive unit, but with this change in the law with AB 602, which we were proud to support, now there's an incentive, or at least there's not a disincentive for building more smaller units, which, whatever smaller means, it's still smaller, which means less expensive, not necessarily cheap, but less overall expensive. Oh, we got a good question here. This is probably a tough one. Roma is asking, how do we convince others, I think others being people who might be skeptical or might not know as much about housing policy, how do we convince people that sound housing policy is important for combating climate change, especially when we're talking about the opportunity for gentle densification, things like what SB 9 allows homeowners to do and what SB 10 makes it easier for cities to do with adding some of that missing middle, not the tiniest homes, not the cheapest homes, but also not the biggest, most expensive homes. How does that connect with climate policy and how do we talk about that in an effective way? And also, I'm curious if people in Sacramento, if legislators and their staff have been thinking or talking about this.
That's a great question. And we have. That is one of the, how do we educate people? And that's what I meant by housing policy is climate change policy. And there's actually literature out there, but all you have to see is the actual growth of different communities. If you look at Southern California, because, for example, Orange County got so expensive, you had a growth in Corona, Riverside, those areas that were previously undeveloped. And you have people that are driving from Inland Empire to the coastal zone, right, to like Orange County or Long Beach, LA to work. And so when you're looking at the actual, one of the major impacts to climate change is transportation and vehicles. And it's all of that driving that we all do. And it's not just one of us. Remember, there's over 38 million people in California. And when the large percentage of them have to drive from Stockton to live in Silicon Valley, that's what causes some of the pollution and some of the problems that we're seeing today. So they go hand in hand. Now, how to convince other people? That's a harder conversation to have. And I think, thank you for asking your question. I think what we need to do is start working on how do we simplify that? How do we start kind of creating a narrative that everybody in California, it becomes a mainstream talking point in the way that we all now recognize how housing is a problem. We should start connecting the two a little more closely.
Yeah. And again, any more questions, please do put them in the chat. Like I said, I've got 1,000. I could keep going, but we really do want everybody else to participate. So another term that you used that people might not be familiar with is ministerial, ministerial approval. What does that mean and why is it important? You specifically talked about it in the context of SB 9, which was an important piece of legislation that we were really excited to support and which we were really happy to see every single legislator representing Santa Clara County supported SB 9. But maybe you could tell us more about what ministerial means.
Actually, Corey, I'm going to punt it back to you, given your local government experience a little bit.
Okay, so the gist of it is when somebody is proposing something, who gets to make the decision at the local level, right? Is it made by a city council where they have discretion to say, we like it, we don't like it, we want you to change it? Or is it decided by the staff? It's the administration at the city level, they say in the planning department, for instance, in most cities, would make the decision about whether something's approved. Does it check the boxes? Does it comply with the zoning? Does it meet the basic rules? And if so, it would be administratively approved or ministerially approved. Did that sound right?
No, that's actually perfect. I mean, and so think about this. Think about when you go pay a parking ticket, because I just had to pay one in Sacramento. Instead of me being able to write a check and just going to the counter and saying, it's like me having to go in front of city council and having city council decide, what the amount is going to be and everything. It just takes a lot longer and it can be very cumbersome. It could create a lot of issues. And what I think Sacramento, the piece of legislation that we're passing in Sacramento is saying, let's create a checklist that's reasonable. And that is going to be the guidance by which program staff is able to take care of it. And so I show up as a developer, let's say SB 9, and as long as I'm able to check all of the things on that list, I should be able to get a permit for a duplex. It doesn't have to be necessarily require any additional bureaucracy. And so we're just trying to kind of, I hate to use this word, but I'm going to use it, cut the red tape. So thanks, Corey. And I think I saw a comment in the chat.
Yeah, we've got a couple more people participating. Thank you for that. We had somebody who shared a comment that they think of themselves as a bit of a skeptic, but they're trying to become an ally. And I'll say thank you for that. Thank you for taking the time and approaching this very complex topic of housing affordability with an open mind. There is a lot to learn. I'm certainly always continuing to learn from people like Graciella and from my colleagues and from the people we interact with around the community. We also have a question, which is, and this is actually tying back to something else you mentioned earlier about accountability. Is it likely that the housing accountability units, which you mentioned, or a housing strike force will take any action towards localities that are passing emergency legislation to actively circumvent SB 9? So maybe there's a couple pieces that one, we've got a housing accountability unit and a housing strike force. I think these are in different departments. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all. And we also have some local cities who are trying to take emergency action to undermine SB 9, which we're not very happy about. And do you think that there might be any interaction and enforcement by those departments about this issue?
That's a really good question. And so here's the challenging thing about SB 9. It doesn't go into effect until January 1st of 2022. So anytime the legislature passes a law, unless it has an urgency clause, so it's explicit, as soon as the governor signs it, it becomes law. Anything else doesn't go into effect until the following year. So local governments actually have the ability to do that. I don't remember SB 9 precluding them from actually taking that local action. So I think what we're going to have to do is be very vigilant and try to figure out how to ensure that some of the ordinances are thoughtful and not trying to actually go around SB 9. And one of the things that I take a little bit of comfort in is the success that we have had with ADU laws. The reason SB 9 became was the next step is because of all the work that happened in ADU.
Oh, and can you just remind people?
What accessory dwelling units.
In-law
yes,
unit, granny units, the
yes,
small little.
I was just going to say.
Yeah. So when you feel like
the granny.
Yeah.
That's what it used to be, right, Corey? Or the granny unit, right? The in-law unit. And when we started to have legislation to make it easier to build, everybody was kind of having the same reaction as they're having to SB9, where it was going to destroy the community. It was going to create density that they did not want. It was going to be problematic. And we saw the same action from local cities trying to stop it. But at the end of the day, what they saw that was it actually did not create the disruption they were afraid of, that it actually created units and invited more families to live in the community in a way that was gentle. They're like, oh, wait, my neighbor has an in-law unit? I had no idea. And so it really demystified and I think was able to address some of the fear. But the reality is that required people at the local level to be very vigilant, flag things for the state. And this is where I think these are going to be the opportunities for the housing unit or the housing accountability unit to really step in. But a lot of that remains to be seen, right? Some of it's like we're learning as we go.
Yeah, we sure are. And so I think, I'm trying to remember which one is which. I don't know if you remember off the top of your head. I think one of these units is with the Department of
Attorney
Housing and
General's
Community
office.
Development, and one's with the Justice Department. Is that right?
That's right. The strike force is with the Attorney General's office, and the Housing Accountability Unit that was created by the budget or in the budget this year, and that's going to be over at the department.
Yeah, in this focus on enforcement, that we've talked about here, and you talked about a bit during your presentation, seems like a real change from the past. And just that attention being paid not just by the legislature, but by departments under the governor, right? In the Justice Department, in the state of California, in Housing and Community Development, or HCD. Is there anything else you want to share about how that change also happened? Is it just kind of like the change we've seen in the legislature? Why are these departments paying such close attention in creating new offices that they haven't created before, just to focus on enforcement? Like what's happening that's inspiring that?
The reality is, as the state has started to pay more attention as to the different ordinances and the local laws that are passed, I think you have cities that really are trying to do a good job and are trying to do their best to make it easy for developers to actually come in and develop. There are other ones that are trying to do everything they can to make it as difficult as possible. And the reality is the policies that they are promoting and passing are creating some of the problems that we see. And so what we have over the last couple of years, as we started to pay more attention as to what is happening at the local level, that has become pretty evident. And so one of the things we're trying to do now is like the same thing we're seeing, for example, SB9 is a perfect example. You have local jurisdictions that are trying to get around the law. Well, that was not the intent of the legislature when they passed SB9. So what we are hoping, the conversation is that if additional attention and accountability is required of the cities, then you're going to stop some of that those games that are played, and you're basically going to try to deter cities, and hopefully they'll do the right thing.
Very good. So any other questions that people want to ask? So what accountability measures will these offices use? Or what kind of measures can be used to hold communities in line? So if HCD or the Justice Department finds that a city went too far, didn't just use their local authority, but exceeded their local authority in shaping SB9 or some other housing law, or denying a project that checked all the boxes, what kind of consequences could there be for the local cities?
Well, and some of that's still going to be kind of fleshed out a little more, but some of the things that have been talked about, for example, is that if you have cities that suddenly their housing element would now be denied. If you don't have an actual housing element that has been approved, and the housing element is basically the city's way of saying, here's how I'm going to comply and make sure that I'm providing affordable units through, the different levels of affordability in my city. If they don't have that planning document that has been approved by HCD, they will not be able to have access to other state funding. So suddenly their transportation funding is at risk. So additional dollars. So that's really how we're hoping to hold them accountable. And obviously there's also saying, you know what, I know that you denied a project, for example, under the Housing Accountability Act, you denied a project that should have been built as an affordable project. You lose your ability to say no to that project, and that project will now be built, right? And so that's kind of some of the tools that the state has to enforce and to kind of make sure that cities are being held accountable.
Not to mention lawsuits are probably another option as well,
Yeah,
right? Where the
exactly.
state can actually sue cities for breaking the law. All right. Is there any other thoughts that that you'd like to share about what people can do at the local level, right? What can we as an organization, what can people on this call, what can, the people we interact with and our friends and family and neighbors, what can we do to be supportive of these kinds of changes in moving the needle in the right direction in Sacramento, for not just on the legislative stuff that we've been talking about and enforcement and local action, but also, on budgetary questions, what can we do to be effective as individuals?
One of the things, and again, I brought this up in the presentation, we're going to have a lot of people that we're going to lose in the legislature in 2024. And so part of it is, who are some of the local electeds right now that you want to support? Who are some of the people at the local level that you're trying to elevate to the state? Because we're going to need those advocates. We're going to need those people to actually fill those seats. So getting involved in some of the local elections would be really a good way. And the other thing is continuing to partner up with organizations like SB at Home, who can help kind of keep everybody in the loop as to what's happening in Sacramento and activate and kind of have your voices heard. The legislature, you would be surprised how many members really care when a constituent calls them. And so just continuing to be active, politically active is a great way.
Yeah, I know you and I have both in the past worked for a local state legislator, actually the same one, and we know those calls matter.
They
whether
matter.
It's somebody calling or writing the office, or when local legislator holds an event, you can go to that event, whether it's a Zoom event or an in-person event. You can go and share your thoughts and put them on the spot. Any other questions? If any other comments that people would like to share? Oh, somebody did share something about Santa Cruz. So that, speaking of the issue of accountability, I didn't know about this. Apparently, the Housing Community Development, or HCD, that department, their Housing Accountability Unit has flagged a property in Santa Cruz as a project that should have been approved. It'll have to go back to the council next week, so they can overturn their own previous denial. That's interesting. I hadn't been following that one down in Santa Cruz. As we own, we're very focused. Aside from the state level stuff, we're really focused just on Santa Clara County, but Santa Cruz isn't that far away.
Thank you for bringing that up, Elizabeth.
We do have a couple more minutes, so if anyone does have any additional questions or thoughts you'd like to share, please do type them out in the chat. We do want to hear from you. We had one question come in, which is, there are a number of legislators that you said are going to be termed out. Do you have a sense of how many of those are really pro-housing legislators who've really supported the 3 Ps, and how many of those kinds of seats will be up for grabs in 2022 or 2024? I don't know if you've done a count yet.
I have not. But the other thing that is going to happen is not just the 2024 election, is what I call the musical chairs, right? I mean, we've already started to see that. As members know that they're going to get turned out, they might leave the seat early, or they might look at other opportunities. Just to give you an example, Assemblymember Bloom, right? He might be running for LA, or he's running for LA Board of Supervisors. That means his seat would be vacated. And so it's not just the members that are termed out, it's also other members moving around and shifting. So that's going to create additional vacancies.
Thank you for that. We had a couple of questions come in. What's the best way to keep a pulse on legislative updates? Well, I'll mention one, which is to be sure to sign up on our website. I'll put a link in the chat right now, which is to go to the Action Funds page, and you can sign up to receive alerts when we put out an action alert. And Yeah, do you have any other recommendations aside from just being on our mailing list and following us on social media? Do you have any other recommendations for how people can keep their finger on the pulse of what's happening in Sacramento?
Social media. Social media and SB at Home updates. Let us do the hard work. We can go ahead and give you kind of some of the things that are important in passing. And yeah, actually, if you want to follow your assembly member or your senator on Twitter, a lot of the times that's a great way of actually just kind of getting tidbits as to what's happening, and you will then know what other people to start following. But social media has been really helpful.
Yeah. When somebody mentioned Los Altos Hills, yeah, we do have a city right here, at least one city here in Santa Clara County, who is, we'll see if they're going a little too far in their SB 9 implementation. It looks like they are. It's important. SB 9, again, SB 9 allows you, if you are a homeowner, to split your lot into 2 lots, not 10, not 20, just split in 2. It also allows you to do a duplex on your property ministerially, or to do both of those things. You can split your lot and do a duplex, so you could have up to 4 units. And it did provide, as we talked about, SB 9 does provide some flexibility for local cities to shape the details of what that looks like. But the question we've been talking about, right, is when cities are adopting those local regulations to implement SB 9, are they going beyond what they're allowed to do? Oh, and thank you. Somebody just shared a link in the chat about 831 Water Street in Santa Cruz. Thank you for that. All right. Well, I think if we're not getting, if anyone has another last minute question, feel free to throw it out there. But there are a couple other things we definitely want to talk about while we are here. I wanted to emphasize, something, kind of building on what we were just talking about. Over the course of the next year, we're really going to do our best to let you all know, let the community know when the SB at Home Action Fund sees that there's a priority that needs some support, whether it's a piece of legislation, a piece of legislation that people need to speak up in favor of, or a question about the budget, right? As we figure out how this big budget surplus is going to get spent, we want to make sure that housing isn't left out of that. We want to build on the really, really positive momentum we had in this last legislative and budget cycle. We want to build on that in 2022. And so we'll do our best to try and keep you informed. Again, please do go sign up and follow us on Twitter and social media, and keep an eye on what we put out. Keep an eye on our newsletters, and when we see that there is a need, we will do our best also to identify a really effective way, an easy way for you to speak up, whether it's signing a petition, sharing a message on social media, sending an email, or sometimes making a call yourself, just picking up the phone and calling your legislator or the governor's office. And so we'll do our best also to recommend what's an effective and easy way to speak up. Of course, you don't have to wait for us. As Graciella said, you can contact your legislator at any time. You can contact their office. You can go to their events, and that's important too. So you don't need to wait for us. I guess if I was going to have one big call to action, Graciella, tell me if you have other thoughts on this. I'd say, besides getting plugged in so you can get alerted, make a commitment, right? Make a commitment today. Talk about it with your friends and your family that you're going to speak up, so that make the commitment today that you will take action when that action is needed. So when those days come, when you see an alert from SB at Home or from one of your friends, or you hear about something that's important, you'll say, this is the day I prepared for. This is the day I planned for. I'm going to take action today, even if it's just signing a petition, because every voice really does matter. So I guess that's my pitch to everybody is follow us, follow others like us, follow your legislators, and make a commitment to speak up.
Thank you again for joining us. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks so much for being here. I really appreciated this conversation, and we really appreciate all the work that you're doing. Thank you so much, Graciella. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Allison.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to Graciella. It's always a pleasure to hear from you and hear about the latest things that are happening in Sacramento and what we can expect ahead. I do want to remind everyone that SB at Home is a membership organization. If you enjoyed today's programming and would like to join SB at Home as a member, you doing that allows us to leverage our resources and work together to get to where we want to be as a state, to get to a state and a county that represents the values that we hold dear of making sure that everyone has a safe, stable home. So my colleague will drop a link in the chat. I think she's done it a couple times already. If you would like to join us as a member, we would love to have you working alongside us. So thanks very much. I'm also going to launch a very short 3-question poll. If you could let us know a little bit about how we did today, whether this event was helpful to you. We would love to have your feedback on that. So thank you so much for that. We do also have an upcoming hack. We are skipping the hack for the month of December. We know you have a lot going on. So we're going to take a month off in December and come back again in January. So Friday, January 28th from 12 to 1 p.m. Our January hack is going to be on renter protections. So Emily, if you would drop the link in the chat so folks can register for that, if you'd like to go ahead and sign up for our January hack. Now's a great time. We'll send you a couple of reminders in the interim, but it's always nice to be one of the first folks in and know that you have that securely on your calendar. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Corey, for hosting or for moderating. Thank you all and have a wonderful day and a great weekend.